Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. Um, Today, we're going to be tackling a really interesting topic, I think, that we've been wanting to do for a while now.
Yeah.
The whole idea of creativity
Mm.
and genius and how that all relates to mental illness.
Right.
We've got a lot of great sources lined up. We've
Yeah.
got academic papers, book excerpts,
Mhm.
even some recent research studies.
Yeah,
So
so can be
we're really excited to get into this.
fascinating.
Yeah. You know, how there's that whole trope of the mad genius.
Oh, yeah.
So we're gonna kind of like unpack that and see
Absolutely.
where that came
See
from.
what holds up to scrutiny.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and what really like the evidence suggests.
Yeah. It's such a fascinating area, too, because it really makes us question how we even define genius and creativity,
Right,
in the first place.
right.
You know, is it just like having a really high IQ score, or
Yeah,
is there something more to it?
right. Because you could be, like you said, brilliant, but never actually create anything,
Exactly.
groundbreaking or that has a real impact. And it seems like that's kind of where our sources are pointing, that it's not just about having a great idea. It's about having
Yeah.
like a real world
Making a real impact.
impact. Yeah, and I think it was one of the things that one of the studies we looked at mentioned this 10-year rule.
Oh, yeah. The 10-year rule.
Yeah, where they say, it takes about a decade of dedicated practice to really achieve mastery in any field.
Right.
So, I mean, think about your own passions.
Yeah.
Like, could you see yourself devoting 10 years to developing a skill or pursuing, a really ambitious project?
It's a huge commitment.
It is a huge commitment.
Yeah.
And that makes you kind of wonder, like, if it's as much about hard work as it is about raw talent,
Right.
like, where does creativity fit into that?
Oh,
Like,
yeah.
is that something you're born with, or
Right. Is that nature or nurture?
is it nature or
Nice.
nurture? Can you cultivate it?
Yeah. And that's where I think things get really interesting. Because you have researchers who believe that creativity is like an emergent property, meaning it kind of arises from all these complex interactions in the brain.
So it's not just like, located in one specific part of the brain,
All right. It's not like the creativity gene or something.
right? It's how all these different parts
So
work together.
It's the interplay.
Yeah.
And one of the key processes that seems to be involved is something called divergent thinking.
Okay, I've heard of that.
Which is the ability to, generate a wide range of ideas or solutions to a problem.
It's like brainstorming on steroids.
Yeah, it's like brainstorming, but it's not just about finding the right answer.
Right,
It's about coming up with as many different ideas
right. Variety is important.
as possible. Exactly. Variety and quantity
Yeah.
over quality, in a way, at least in the initial stages.
Yeah, and I can see how that would be super important for any kind of creative breakthrough, whether you're like a composer trying to write a symphony or you're an engineer
Right.
designing, a new bridge or something.
Exactly. It
Yeah.
applies across domains.
But here's where I get a little tripped up because,
Yeah.
some of the sources we're looking at talk about this potential link between creativity and certain mental disorders.
Yes.
Like bipolar disorder and schizotypy.
Right.
And, how do we even start to like make sense of that
Right.
without, falling into these like stereotypes?
Right. It's a crucial point because I think the connection is much more nuanced than
Right.
it might seem at first glance. Having a mental disorder doesn't automatically make you creative.
Right.
And in fact, the majority of creative individuals are mentally healthy.
Right.
But there are these intriguing overlaps in terms of
Right.
how the brain processes information.
So it's not like cause and effect. It's more like
Right. It's not a direct causal link.
they might share some underlying mechanism.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one of the things that researchers have put forward is this idea of controlled weirdness,
Okay.
which I think is quite insightful.
Yeah.
And it suggests that both creative individuals and those with certain mental disorders tend to think outside the box. They see patterns and connections that others might miss.
Right.
But in the case of mental illness, that weirdness can become overwhelming
Right.
and less controlled. And that's when it leads to distress and dysfunction.
So it's like they're kind of riding the edge.
Exactly. They're kind of on that spectrum.
Harnessing those like unusual thought patterns, but not letting them
Yeah.
spiral out of control. It's like walking a tightrope.
It's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And there's actually some really interesting research that supports this idea. There was one study that found that relatives of people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder are actually overrepresented
Wow.
in creative professions.
That's really interesting.
Isn't that fascinating?
Yeah.
So it suggests that there might be this shared genetic predisposition,
Okay.
a kind of cognitive flexibility that can manifest in different ways.
So it's not that mental illness causes creativity, but
Right.
that
It's more that there's this underlying
the same
wiring that's at play.
might be at play.
In both.
Right. And that kind of brings us back to the whole, like, mad genius myth.
Exactly. It brings us to the heart of it.
Right. It's this story that's been around for centuries, but as we're starting to see,
Yeah.
it's way more complex than that.
Yeah. The reality is far more nuanced.
Yeah. You can't just say, like, oh, all creative people are mentally ill or
Right.
all geniuses are
Exactly. We
Right.
can't simply equate the two.
tortured souls.
Right.
Yeah.
There's more to the story.
There's definitely more to the story.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so we've kind of established that the link between creativity and mental illness is a lot more nuanced than that mad genius myth
Right.
would have us believe.
Yeah.
But where did this idea even come from in the first place?
Well, it's a story with deep roots, actually. It goes all the way back to ancient Greece.
Oh,
You know, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, they actually believed there was this connection between creativity and what they called melancholia,
Melancholy.
which was the state of like profound contemplation that could sometimes tip into despair.
So it's not so much madness as just like
Right.
intense thoughtfulness or...
Exactly. A kind of intense inward focus.
Okay.
And they even saw it as a potential source of creativity. You know, they believed that poets and priests and even philosophers needed this touch of melancholia to access like deeper truths
Wow.
and create truly great works.
So they weren't necessarily afraid of these kind of darker states of mind.
Yeah.
They actually saw them as like a pathway to
Yeah. A pathway to inspiration.
inspiration.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
interesting.
Exactly. Of course, their understanding of mental states was quite different from ours today.
Right.
But it's fascinating to see how these early thinkers were grappling with the same questions we're still exploring.
Yeah.
You know, what is the relationship between our inner world and our creative output?
Right. And it seems like this idea really took hold during the Romantic era.
Absolutely.
You know, when you had these like larger-than-life figures who seemed to channel their emotional turmoil into their art.
Exactly. You think about figures like Lord Byron, Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley. They all kind of fit that image of the tortured artist, you know, drawing inspiration from their inner demons.
Right, pushing the boundaries.
Exactly. Pushing the boundaries of conventional thought.
Yeah. And that image has become so pervasive
It really has.
in our culture.
Yeah.
You know, we almost expect creative people to be a little bit eccentric,
Right. A little bit offbeat.
maybe even a little troubled.
Yeah. And that's where the myth can become problematic.
Right.
Because it can romanticize mental illness
Oh, yeah.
and create the sense that suffering is somehow necessary for creative brilliance,
Right, which is obviously not true.
which of course is not true at all.
And it ignores all the creative geniuses throughout history who were
Right.
perfectly well-adjusted individuals. You know?
Exactly. Not every brilliant artist or scientist is a tortured soul.
Right, exactly. So while it's interesting to kind of explore the historical roots of this idea,
Yeah.
it's important to remember that the mad genius myth is just that it's a myth.
It's a myth.
It's not an accurate reflection of either creativity or
Yeah.
mental health.
It doesn't reflect the complex reality of either one.
Okay, so let's move beyond the myth then
Yeah, let's delve into the science.
and look at what the science actually has to say
Exactly.
about this whole connection. Because our sources actually get into some pretty fascinating research on the biological underpinnings of creativity,
Yes.
suggesting there might be certain genes that actually predispose individuals to both creative thinking and
It's really cutting-edge stuff.
mental health challenges.
Yeah, researchers are using twin and adoption studies
Oh.
to try to tease apart the influence of genetics versus environment.
Nature versus nurture.
Exactly. And what they're finding is that both play a role.
Yeah.
For example, there's a gene called neuregulin-1,
Okay.
or NRG1 for short,
Catchy.
which has been linked to both psychosis and creativity.
Interesting. So it's not like there's a single creativity gene,
Right.
but rather a complex interplay of
Right. It's a complex interplay of different genetic factors.
different genetic factors.
And then we also have to consider the role of neurotransmitters,
like dopamine and serotonin,
which are involved in
mood regulation,
Yeah.
motivation, and cognitive flexibility.
So we're talking about brain chemistry as well as genes.
Exactly. It's all interconnected.
But if there is this kind of genetic predisposition, how does the environment either like enhance or suppress those
That's a great question.
Creative tendencies.
Because you think about those child prodigies
Right.
who seem to blossom in supportive and stimulating environments.
Exactly. So clearly the environment has a role to play as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it speaks to this fascinating concept called the zeitgeist,
The zeitgeist.
which basically means the spirit of the times.
Okay.
You know, the social and cultural context we live in shapes not only what's considered creative,
Right.
but also how those creative expressions are received and valued.
So like a brilliant artist or musician could be completely overlooked if they're born in the wrong place at the wrong time.
It's definitely possible. Think about how artistic styles have changed over the centuries.
Right. What was groundbreaking in one era might be seen as outdated or even offensive in another.
That's a really good point.
So it makes you wonder how many creative geniuses have been lost to history simply because their ideas were too ahead of their time.
Wow. And that's why it's so important, I guess, to cultivate an environment that encourages exploration and experimentation.
Exactly.
And even a little bit of that controlled weirdness we were talking about.
A healthy dose of controlled weirdness.
Right. Because sometimes those unconventional ideas are the ones that end up changing the world.
Precisely.
But it's not just about individual expression, is it?
Right.
Our sources also emphasize the importance of social connections and collaborations
Absolutely.
in fostering creativity.
Creative breakthroughs rarely happen in isolation.
Right.
You know, we need to bounce ideas off each other, challenge each other's assumptions, and inspire each other to reach new heights. Think about those incredible artistic movements throughout history, like the Renaissance or the Impressionists. They were all fueled by these communities of artists supporting and inspiring each other.
So it's not just nature versus nurture. It's also this dynamic interplay between, like, individual talent
Exactly.
and the social environment.
It's this interplay between the individual and the collective.
Right. That's fascinating.
It's a really complex and dynamic process.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, exploring, like, the myths and the science and the historical context of this whole mad genius idea.
We have. It's been a fascinating journey.
But I'm curious, like, what does this all mean for us? You know, what can we actually do with this knowledge?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do we apply this to our lives?
Yeah.
One of the most important takeaways, I think, is that we need to challenge these harmful stereotypes
Right.
that still surround both creativity and mental illness.
Totally.
Yeah.
We can't let the mad genius myth limit our understanding of, like, human potential.
Exactly.
But I'm also really interested in the practical side of things. Like, if creativity can be nurtured, how do we actually do that? What steps can we take to kind of foster those sparks of brilliance in ourselves and in others?
Well, you know, remember that concept of controlled weirdness we talked about earlier?
Yeah, I like that one.
It's really about encouraging a healthy dose of unconventional thinking, curiosity, even a bit of rebelliousness.
Okay.
You know, those qualities can help us break free from rigid thinking patterns and see the world in new and unexpected ways.
So it's about giving ourselves permission to be a little bit different
Exactly. Permission to think outside the box.
and think outside the box.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put that into practice? Should we all be taking improv classes or
Right.
learning to paint abstract art?
Those can definitely be fun and helpful ways to kind of tap into your creative side, but it's really about cultivating a mindset
Okay.
that's open to new experiences and different perspectives.
Okay.
One simple but powerful exercise is to actually practice divergent thinking.
Okay.
So instead of trying to find the right answer,
Right.
challenge yourself to come up with as many different solutions to a problem as possible.
Even if they're bad.
Even if some of them seem silly or impractical at first.
So it's like brainstorming without judgment.
Exactly. Let those ideas flow freely.
Just let it flow.
Don't censor yourself.
But I imagine there's a balance, right? Because you can't just have a million ideas floating around. You have to be able to, like, focus and refine them at some point.
Absolutely. It's like a dance between divergent and convergent thinking.
Okay.
Divergent thinking helps us generate those initial sparks of inspiration,
Right.
while convergent thinking helps us shape those raw ideas into something more tangible and meaningful.
So, like, divergent thinking is the artist who creates the wild and imaginative sketch.
Exactly.
Convergent thinking is the craftsperson who, like, meticulously sculpts that vision into a masterpiece.
Beautiful analogy. I love that.
It makes me think about the role of education. Like, if we want to foster a society that really values and supports creativity, shouldn't we be teaching these skills to kids from a young age?
I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, traditional education often prioritizes rote memorization and conformity over exploration and experimentation.
Yeah. It's all about getting the right answer.
Exactly. But imagine a world where kids are encouraged to ask why instead of just what.
Right.
A world where they're given the freedom to tinker, to play, to fail without fear of judgment.
Yeah.
That kind of environment could nurture a whole generation of innovators and creative thinkers.
That sounds like a world I want to live in.
Me too.
But I also wonder about those broader social and cultural influences we talked about.
Right, the zeitgeist.
Yeah, if the zeitgeist shapes creative output,
Mhm.
what does that mean for us right now? Are we
Yeah.
living in a time that supports creativity or stifles it?
That's a question each listener will have to ponder for themselves.
Yeah.
But it's worth considering the unique opportunities and challenges of our current moment. You know, we live in an era of unprecedented access to information technology, interconnectedness. The potential for creative collaboration and cross-pollination of ideas has never been greater.
All right, we have all these amazing tools.
We do, but on the other hand, we're also bombarded with distractions.
Yeah.
Pressure to conform, a constant stream of prepackaged content.
It's almost like we're standing at a crossroads with the potential for both incredible creative breakthroughs and a kind of like homogenization of thought.
That's a great way to put it. It's up to each of us to choose which path we want to follow.
And that's the beauty of understanding this whole complex interplay of creativity, genius, and mental illness.
Right.
It empowers us to become more conscious creators of our own lives and our shared world.
Beautifully said. I love that.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive, what's one final piece of wisdom you want to leave our listeners with?
Remember this. The mad genius myth might be compelling, but it's ultimately limiting.
Okay,
True creative potential lies in embracing our own unique cognitive styles,
I like that.
nurturing those controlled weirdness quirks that make us who we are, and recognizing that the spark of genius might be flickering within each of us, just waiting to be kindled.
I love that. So to our listeners, go forth and be brilliantly weird.
Yes, embrace your weirdness.
Embrace the chaos. Seek out the unexpected, and never stop exploring the infinite possibilities of your own creative mind.
Well said.
And that's a wrap on another deep dive.
That's a wrap.
Until next time,
Yeah.
keep learning, keep questioning, and keep those creative fires burning.